Well, welcome everybody to this year's Fernando lecture. We're very pleased again to host this lecture. The Smith School was established, I guess, about 10 years ago. I have to keep track sometimes, to undertake research, teaching and engagement on the most important issue facing us in the 21st century, climate change and all its manifestations, economic, financial, personal well-being and much else beside. The Smith School, of course, has a fundamental interest in the economic, financial and geographical. We have an interest obviously in climate change and its manifestations, but fundamentally the environment in many shapes and sizes comes in. So we very much enjoy hosting this event on an annual basis, because it gives us a chance to bring some of the best people in the world here to give a lecture and to learn, I suppose, a little bit about what the Smith School in Oxford is doing in the area of climate change and research, social science research. The Fernando lecture is an annual event which honours the memory of Adrian Fernando, one of the founders of Eco-Securities. This company was one of the first to take seriously the environment as an economic and financial issue. It was established in Oxford and ended up in Wall Street. Big exclamation mark. It's a long distance travel, but it tells you something about how Wall Street at the time grasped the idea about the pricing of the environment over the longer term. It literally set the stage for carbon pricing in financial markets, and it has applications around the world. I'd like to recognise in the audience today past employees of the company, as well as Adrian's son Max, who is also here at the lecture and will be at the reception following the lecture. That is, there's drinks, not to be underestimated. The lecture today will be given by Professor Elke, the Gerhard Andlinger Professor in Energy and the Environment, Professor of Psychology and Public Affairs at Princeton University. Professor Weber received her BA from York University in Toronto, a Master's PhD from Harvard. Prior to her appointment at Princeton, she was the Chazen Professor of International Business at Columbia Business School, Professor of Psychology and Earth Institute Professor at Columbia University. I like cognitive scientists. Not many are in this space at the intersection between decision-making, context and environment. It's a really important place to be. It is fundamentally important when we think about making decisions about the future, that is, about our children, their children, and much beyond. So it is really important to make that link actually between the research we do here at Oxford on climate change, but also human behaviour and how the future is conceived and acted upon. The research is focused upon decision-making under uncertainty and time delay in financial and environmental situations from a psychological and neuroscience perspective. Her work is highly cited. We have a star amongst us whose impact in the discipline across cognitive science psychology has been formidable. She combines remarkable insight about everyday decision-making with an acute sense of the world lived and experienced. Her work is characterised by interesting problems, methodological rigour and empirical precision. Her expertise in the behavioural decision sciences has been sought out by advisory committees of the US National Academy of Sciences, and particularly on their human dimensions in global change program. The American Psychological Association Task Force, which issued a report at the interface between psychology and global climate change. The Working Group 3 for the 5th assessment report of the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. She is past president. I will stop. She is past president of the Society for Neuroeconomics, the Society for Judgment and Decision Making, and the Society for Mathematical Psychology. She is a fellow of the American Psychological Association, the Association for Psychological Science. Must explain to me over dinner actually how that all sort of works together. And the Society for Risk Analysis, Society for Experimental Psychology, and received the Distinguished Scientific Contribution Award from the Society for Risk Analysis. She's been elected to the German National Academy of Sciences and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. The lecture today is entitled Giving the Future a Chance. The plan is for her to speak for about 40 minutes, take questions, then we'll go downstairs and have drinks and whatever that follows. So, welcome, Professor Webb.
It is a real honor and a pleasure to be here today. And thank you so much for that very generous introduction. I hope you won't be disappointed after that. I don't need this introduction for this audience. You all know that we live in a world where human behavior is in fact shaping the present and future of our planet, and largely through our behavior vis-a-vis energy, the type of energy we consume and the amount of energy we consume. When you look at analyses, integrated assessment reports, public and corporate strategic planning on how changes in behavior in that space will impact the environment, the basic assumption is one of rationality. We're dealing with Homo economicus, a creature who has infinite processing capacity and learns perfectly and uses all information at any given point in time to shape decisions that will maximize individual utility. Now, what I want to argue is that we're dealing with not Homo economicus, but Homo sapiens. Homo economicus being a subset of the processes and a subset of the goals and values that guide the behavior of Homo sapiens. So Homo sapiens, we, are not primarily creatures of rational deliberation. We certainly can process information rationally. We have the wetware for it. We have to learn the software by going to college courses. It's not something that comes natural to us. The kinds of processes that are bred in the bone, that are natural to us, that are largely automatic, are based on learning from experience. Pain is a great teacher. Associations, many in the form of emotions. If it feels good, we approach, we want more. If it's scary, we back off. And also rules, standard operating procedures, moral rules of conduct that guide our behavior, oftentimes actually designed to override selfish utility maximization. And so getting to the goals part of things, we have many goals, including individual material goals, but we also have other regarding preferences, both positive and negative. There's Schadenfreude. And we also have psychological goals. We need to feel in charge. We need to feel in control. We need to feel confident about our decisions. So the problem is not that we don't know what we want. We want too many things. We want to have our cake and eat it too. It turns out that our goals oftentimes are contradictory. Very few of us want to screw up planet Earth for future generations, but it's other goals, maybe more immediate goals, more personal goals that get in the way of satisfying that more fundamental goal. So as it turns out, it's only the goals that are active at the time of decision that shape our decision. And so sort of one of the recipes in a way for helping people make more foresightful decisions, maybe to question ourselves how to activate those goals that matter in that space. So climate change, in many ways, is a perfect storm. I realized that early on in the 1970s and 80s, that if you're interested in studying decisions under risk, under uncertainty, decisions with long time horizons, it's fine to study healthy or unhealthy eating, where present self makes a decision for future self, to study pension allocation, saving for your pension or failing to save for pensions, again, present self, saving for future self. But climate change and environmental decisions in many ways are much more complex, in part because the time horizons are longer and because there also are collective action implications. So if we can solve this problem, everything else is icing on the cake. There would be no more pension obesity epidemic, and we will all save for our future selves. On top of that, also, I think one of the factors that reduces our motivation to do something about climate change is that the solutions don't seem to be so obvious. The problem is massive. Collective action is required. There are many uncertainties, not just with respect to the climate system and the economic system, technology, but also the social system. And there really is no silver bullet. We might have silver buckshot, but that silver buckshot has to be coordinated. And that's not a problem that we sort of deal with very easily. So, again, I don't need the slide for this audience, but you all know that attention and action on climate change is probably very minor vis-a-vis the problem that we're facing. This is true at the business level. It's true at the investor level. It's certainly true at the political level. And what I'm sort of mostly focused on at the individual level. The energy efficiency paradox being just one of the manifestations. We don't make progress on power grids because nobody wants to have these transmission lines in their backyard. And as we talk about carbon capture and storage or geoengineering, sort of nobody really sort of worries about public acceptance of these issues in the political world to go forward with new technologies. So we will need breakthroughs. And obviously, we have to price greenhouse gas pollution externalities. There's no question about that. But I think the other breakthrough that we really need, both in terms of sort of having models that predict in more realistic ways that what will happen, integrated assessment models and other such macro models, but also at the more concrete and individual level, we have to stop assuming that all behavior is rational, or not rational all the time. I think we have to do that both to arrive at better predictions, but maybe more fundamentally, once you have a good process model of how we actually make decisions in these multiple ways for these multiple purposes, then we also can design decision environments that make it more likely that the processes that we use naturally will lead to better outcomes. And so much of my work has to do with designing decision environments, choice architecture, broadly defined, that capitalizes on the insights that we have derived about human decision making. So we have to overcome our fear of change, and I will say a little bit about how and why and how we fear change, the limits of the imagination that come with status quo bias, and in general status quo bias as a phenomenon. Henry Ford apocryphally said if I had asked people what they wanted when he invented the automobile, they would have said faster horses. And arguably maybe that wouldn't have been such a bad solution in light of our current dilemma. But there's no question that at the time the automobile increased public welfare. And I think what this also shows, though, is that so much of our innovation is incremental rather than radical and disruptive. And so the question is how to change that mindset. Okay, so what I want to tell you about are three areas of research where we've tried to give the future a chance in the sense of understanding some of the reasons for why status quo bias seems to be so prevalent, why we maybe shouldn't be surprised that people don't like change, why we should be surprised that people ever change instead, but then also how to overcome it. So I will tell you about query theory, which is a theory that I and colleagues developed over the last 10 or 15 years. That is a cognitive intervention. And then also we'll talk about sort of two motivational processes and motivational interventions that come from understanding those motivational processes. Legacy motives, and how to prime those, and to use the past in our realization and recognition of a long and illustrious past as a way of mirroring people that we might have a long and illustrious future ahead of us, which makes it worth investing into it. Okay, so let's start with part one. So what is query theory? Query theory is a general theory that tries to account for how we decide between option A and option B, how we set a price for something, what's value increasing, what's value decreasing about this commodity. It's a process that says we essentially argue with ourselves, not necessarily by conscious awareness, but by saying what's good about option A, what's good about my 1 marshmallow now, and what argues for waiting 20 minutes and getting 2 marshmallows. Okay? So far, so good. The problem is that we are finite information processes. We can't think about 2 options at the same time. We can switch back and forth between them. We think about one and then the other. Just the way when you see these reversible visual images, you can see the candlestick, the white candlestick, if you focus as a white. Or you can see these 2 people looking at each other if you focus on the black as a foreground. You can certainly switch back and forth between those 2 impressions, but you can't see them both at the same time. Well, the argument is that in the same way, we first think about the one option, the 1 marshmallow now, and then the other option, the 2 marshmallows later. We might, again, switch back and forth between them. And so far, so good. I mean, that's fine, right? As long as you think about both options and you generate all arguments, and then you choose the one that has more arguments in its scale. So far, so good. Well, the problem is that the first option you consider has a huge advantage. Now, why would that be? As you think about what's good about that 1 marshmallow now, you temporarily inhibit all arguments for any other response competitors, any other options. You want to do that because you first want to evaluate based on past experience with that option, based on external information, what argues for that 1 option. Then you switch to the next one, the 2 marshmallows later, and just because you temporarily inhibited arguments for it, they have a harder time coming to the surface. Okay? So the million-dollar question, all other things being equal, is what option do people consider first? Well, guess what? That's why we have advertising, right? Advertising says, over here, look at me first. Yeah? Obviously, that exists because it has been proven successful. Let's come back to giving the future a chance and a quantitative version of the marshmallow test that Walter Mischel made famous at Stanford 30 years ago. This is a very typical intertemporal decision that you're facing. You're assigned to get some amount of money today. You're assigned to receive your iPhone in the mail today. Okay? But then something happens and says, well, sorry, we couldn't deliver your iPhone with some problems with production. How much money do we have to give you so that you're not unhappy with this delay of 2 weeks? Yeah? Or in this case, $58.30 today. But if you're willing to wait 2 weeks, you can get quite a bit more money. It turns out that most people actually choose the amount of money on the left. And you don't want to know what kind of implicit interest rate that has. It's huge. Now, let's look at this decision. Now, I'm telling you, you're assigned to get your $70.90 in 2 weeks' time. But if you want to, you can get money right away. Of course, it has to be less. Yeah? It's only $65.40. You're expecting your iPhone in 2 weeks' time, and Apple calls you and says, you can have it today. How much more are you willing to pay? Yeah? Now, just do the thought experiment. People are asking for twice as much money in the first decision, so that they're not upset with this delay in delivery, as they're willing to pay to speed up the delivery. And similarly here, even though most people pick the option on the left, when that's the default option, people also pick the default option on the left when they're assigned to get that, even though, as you can see, the trade-off is much worse in both situations. So one answer to the question, which option gets considered first, the million-dollar question, is people first think about default options. Defaults, in this case, we had an assigned default, a recommendation, presumably, an implicit recommendation that is a better one. But defaults oftentimes are behavioral defaults. We've been doing something for a while. You've been driving a gasoline car for a long time. Should you switch to an electric vehicle? Well, it makes sense to first think about what you had. You had some good reason to choose it in the first place. You've been doing it for a while. It hasn't killed you yet. It can't be all that risky. And so in most situations, it makes sense to think about the default option first. But you can also see that sort of doing that gives status quo an advantage. Okay? So just to show this, and this phenomenon in the context of intertemporal choice goes back a while. George Lowenstein, a behavioral economist, demonstrated that in 1988. And so we were interested in testing the extent to which query theory processes explain this asymmetry in discounting. Yeah, sort of being twice as impatient when immediate consumption is a default option than if delayed consumption is a default option. And so basically we gave people a variety of choices like the ones you just saw. We impute a discount factor from that. The discount factor on the left is telling you how much is $1 in a year's time worth to you today. How much do you discount down with a 1 year time horizon. And as you can see, in the delay condition, $1 in a year's time is only worth 34 cents to you today. Again, a huge discount rate. Whereas in acceleration condition, when the later consumption is a default, that discounting is much reduced. $1 in a year's time is worth 57 cents to you today. Okay, so we replicate the Lowenstein phenomenon, highly significant difference. Now the question is, do query theory processes account for that? Yeah? Now remember what query theory says. First of all, it says that we will process arguments for one alternative or the other alternative sequentially. That means that arguments for option 1 or option 2, immediate money or more delayed money, sooner, smaller, larger, later, should be clustered. And one thing we do in these studies, we ask people before they make this decision, they see the decision before they make it, and it's done online, they think out loud or type out loud what goes through their mind as they make this decision. Now, we don't assume, query theory does not assume that generating these arguments is a conscious process. But what we're doing with our procedure is we're externalizing and making conscious this internal and automatic flow of information that comes in. One thing that you can check is whether or not typing out loud, generating this stream of arguments interferes with the choice process in the sense that if you don't do this or if you do it, you get different answers. We always verify that. We always get identical answers. The choices don't differ. But what you can do then is you can take these arguments that people generate and we train them to hit carriage returns between each thought. You can now look at these arguments and say, okay, does this argument favor the sooner, smaller option, a larger, later option, both or neither? And then you can see whether or not the arguments for the sooner, smaller option cluster, or are they randomly interspersed. In this case, the index would be 0. Okay? And as you can see in both of these conditions, there is significant clustering, and it's in the direction query theory predicts. In other words, when the immediate consumption option is the default option, is what we expect to get, then we generate arguments for that option first. Okay? And if it's not, then we generate arguments for that option second. Now, the other thing that query theory says is that this difference in clustering, this difference in order, will generate a different frequency of arguments for one option or the other. Of course, people are randomly assigned to those two conditions, so on average, they should have the same number of arguments for one option or for the other one. As you can see here on the slide on the right, there's a much larger proportion for immediate consumption, impatient aspects, if you want. 39% in the delay condition, where that option is considered first. We generate more arguments than when that section is that option is considered second. And then in combination, those two, in combination, the frequency and the clustering completely predicts the differences in choice. You can do a mitigation analysis for those of you who are interested in the statistics here. Okay, but some of you might say, well, I've done history of science. I know correlation is not causation. So show me that sort of your theory actually can sort of causally change choices by intervening in the process. Okay? And as I said, we assume that queries are ordered or are queried sequentially. Defaults are considered first. And so there's a quote-unquote natural order that we diagnosed in the previous study. Okay? And so we can put people into the delay condition and we show them we can now ask them explicitly to generate arguments for immediate consumption now or for later consumption second in the quote-unquote natural order. Okay, and then we would expect to sort of get the same results as we did before, perhaps even stronger, because you saw on the previous slides the clustering was not perfect. And so now the clustering will be perfect because we're telling them to generate arguments for one option first. So it should be the same direction and stronger. Or we can put them into the same conditions but ask them to generate arguments in the opposite order. So now basically I'm causally manipulating, I'm manipulating query order. Yeah? And that should then sort of basically result in a difference in choice, mediated by differences, as we said explicitly now, of query order, which should result in different frequencies. Just to show you the choice results, again, we have delay condition and acceleration condition. In the natural order, where people are doing it explicitly in the way they did it before, the difference in impatience has become even stronger. And in the unnatural order now, it has not reversed, but it has become non-significant. And I think what's going on is we're telling them explicitly to do it in an unnatural order. What's happening automatically is still the natural order, and these two things cancel each other out, and that's why sort of you get a wash. And you can actually verify that by looking at the arguments that people generate in those two conditions, and you find confirmation for that canceling out by doing things explicitly, implicitly in different ways. So that suggests now that given the future, a chance can be accomplished by maybe making the larger later options the default. Right? And how do we do that in an environmental context? Well, you can study this again in the lab, and there's a very nice study, a summary of these research reports by Kassanstein and Reich in the Harvard Environmental Law Review 2 or 3 years back. And they basically show that time after time after time, when people do it either in the lab, like in this case, sort of giving people CFL bulbs, a choice between CFL versus incandescent bulbs, and changing the default, sort of you're expected to get this one, but you can switch to something else. The building code requires one or the other. You find a preference, a strong switch in preference for the default option. Electricity providers, green providers versus conventional brown electricity providers. Field studies in very conservative German towns and cities in Bavaria show that when you provide electricity by default the brown way and ask people to switch to the green one by sending a letter in the mail, not surprisingly, people don't switch. Right? People stick with the status quo. Most of us don't even open the mail, we just toss it. If you do the opposite, the letter that you don't open says, okay, from tomorrow on, you will be in the optimal mix of green electricity. Again, people sort of don't open letters, so it's not surprising that the next month, most of them will stay with this default. What's interesting is what happens 6 months later, or a year later, or 2 years later, when people realize that oftentimes their bill has gone up by 10 to 15%, and for whatever reasons, very few people switch. Like it's less than 10% of people who switch after like a long period of time. So defaults stick initially, and defaults continue to stick down the road. So we thought it would be interesting to maybe investigate the effectiveness of defaults in the domain of architecture. So getting this to maybe more influential decision makers. It's one thing to switch to an LED from incandescent light bulbs for yourself or for your household, but that requires a lot of scaling up. So a lot of households have to do this. It's so much easier if you have engineers, infrastructure engineers and architects build houses or build infrastructure, traffic infrastructure that has more sustainable characteristics. And so the other question you can answer with that is sort of do more sophisticated and more highly educated decision makers who make a decision in their domain of expertise, are they also susceptible to the effect of defaults? Or is it something that sort of only applies to the general public, to sort of relatively unsophisticated decisions and decision makers, where incentives might be relatively minor? And so if you look at the reasons that architects and engineers cite for making their systems more sustainable, it has to do with building codes, and also has to do with rating systems. You might be familiar with LEEDs. It's very popular in the United States. It applies to buildings. We worked with a company called Envision that has a very similar rating system, but it applies to a broader range of infrastructure projects, not just buildings. And the way the current system works, basically current practice, current industry norms are the default option. And if you do better than that, if you do better than business as usual, you earn points. You earn points across a number of dimensions, and if you get enough points, you get LEED silver or gold or platinum. So we thought, well, why don't we change the default, the thing that is automatically pre-checked or implicitly pre-checked in people's mind, from industry norm to the second most aspirational level, to the conserving level, by just pre-checking that box. Okay, on the website that takes you through making these infrastructure decisions. And if you don't want that, you can go down, but you lose points. So the points you were endowed with, you lose them. And so we're putting to work query theory by saying, okay, in the current system, people will focus on industry norm as a default option and think about its arguments first. But when they see the conserving level pre-checked, they will take that as a recommendation and as an implicit default and think about those arguments first. And of course, we can test that using our query theory manipulation of asking people for their reasons. Also, you might notice that this puts to work prospect theory. And some of you might be familiar with prospect theory. It won the Nobel Prize for Economic Science in 2002. It's basically psychologists' band-aids on expected utility theory. Making expected utility theory apply in a broader range of contexts by introducing reference points. It's not that we incorporate all of our outcomes into like overall net wealth, but yeah, we actually it's with respect to our current wealth level. We can gain money, we can lose money. That shouldn't matter if we're the linear utility function, but we don't. As economics has maintained for a long time, most people are risk averse. They have a concave utility function in the domain of gains. But it turns out when people see something as choices between a sure loss or an uncertain loss, perhaps with a higher expected value, they are risk-seeking. Nobody wants to lose money for sure, and we're willing to take our chance on that. Sounds a little bit like climate change, right? We're thinking about losing a certain amount of GDP now, a certain amount of standard of living and comfort level now to avoid a potentially much larger loss in the future. We're taking our chances on it by all intents and purposes. And so the question was, and so also prospect theory, not surprisingly, would also explain this phenomenon, because in the left-hand side, basically, or the other thing I should say is the second important feature of prospect theory is loss aversion. So a loss of a certain magnitude, losing $100, hurts twice as much as gaining $100 feels good. So if that's the case, that is bad news for change, right? But think about what change is. Change means we're giving up something that we have right now for something that is potentially better. But if that potentially better has to be twice as good than what we have right now, that means that in only a very small number of cases will we embrace change because of loss aversion. I should say that query theory is not a rival theory to prospect theory. Query theory is the under the hood psychological process level theory that explains why the functional regularities that prospect theory is predicting come about. So they're, in some sense, they're parent and child relationship. The parental one is the functional one, and query theory is the psychological process one that explains why one comes about. So did it work? The answer is yes. Basically, this was presented as a problem to train people in the use of Envision, and so half of our engineers got to see it in the original version, and the other half got the new version. Everybody saw exactly the same problem, and they were taken through it, explained to them an urban park and different features of that. But as you can see, in a nutshell, people who were endowed with a more radical, more sustainable, conserving level scored but something like 24% higher on the final level of sustainability. And where rationally, clearly there shouldn't have been any difference. It should just be what argues for business as usual, what argues for higher levels. Right now we're taking this into the field to see whether different versions of this actually also apply to people's actual projects, where you have real clients and where you have to predict how your client will be, what values their client has with respect to sustainability and higher costs. And so we'll see in a couple of years what happens across this range of problems. But certainly on this training problem, this was highly effective. Now, we've been talking a lot about status quo bias. And here we now actually have the printed word prospect theory, and then that both prospect theory and query theory predict that people should object to change. So in other words, we should not be surprised that people don't like change, both because we first think about what's good about what we have, query theory, and because we hate to lose what we have, prospect theory. They both predict that you should be surprised when people don't object to change. Now, what happens when the status quo gets changed anyway, against public opposition to it? It could be an act of God, and you might recognize the old Embarcadero Freeway, which was broadly considered a big mistake shortly after it was built. It was cutting the city off from the Bay Area, but traffic engineers didn't want to give up on it because it would create traffic chaos, was the prediction. Chinatown merchants didn't want to give up on it because the Embarcadero Freeway actually ended in Chinatown, so everybody was automatically directed there. And so for 30 years, the city argued about it. Nothing was done. And then we had an earthquake, which basically took care of the Embarcadero Freeway. The new status quo was no freeway. And there's no question that, so from an economic perspective, from a visual perspective, that an Embarcadero-free San Francisco is a better option. But it took an act of God. Now, God doesn't always cooperate in this way. Sometimes you need a bold politician who says, I've done my analysis, a change in affairs, a carbon tax, no smoking in restaurants will improve public welfare. And if you don't like it, screw you. I'm rich. You don't have to re-elect me. I have other things to do. And so we basically analyzed two contentious political decisions. One, the smoking ban in New York City that Mayor Bloomberg announced in 2002 and implemented in 2003. And one of the first carbon taxes in 2008. The province of British Columbia in Canada. It was very well implemented. It was a revenue neutral carbon tax. Every 6 months, residents were getting a check in the mail. And if you basically sort of consumed less electricity or less carbon, emitted less carbon than you were getting paid, you were making money on that. Yeah, and so in both cases, also with the smoking ban, there was no question. Now it's a poster child for enlightened public policy with respect to public health. There was hardly ever any question that sort of from a public perspective, these were the right decisions to take, and yet there was a lot of public outcry against both of them. And so we did a media analysis in the two cities, and basically looking at net sentiment in newspaper articles at the time. And as you can see from time of announcement on the very left, public sentiment goes south. Goes strongly negative after a short period of time. It bottoms out at the implementation of the policy. This is for the smoking ban. And then it becomes net positive again. Now, why would it become net positive again? Well, think about query theory. People hate change because they think about the status quo first. But now somebody makes the hated change the new status quo. And if it does improve public welfare, you will experience those improvements. You can actually now go to a jazz club without having to dry clean all your clothes and wash your hair the next day. Presumably, there are other positive consequences as well. So you experience the positive consequences. But the other psychological query theory effect is that after a period of time, you will not think about that hated state of affairs as a hated state of affairs, but as a new status quo. Yeah? And then all the arguments, all the advantages for the status quo will kick in for that new option. The question for elected officials or officials who want to be reelected is how long is that transition period? Right? And of course, that's going to depend probably on how noticeable the improvements are in citizens, in voters' public welfare. But there also might be just sort of like a general sort of time readjustment period before a new state becomes status quo. So let's look at these two examples. In this case, it was 15 months. And in the case of the BC carbon tax, where the trajectory of public sentiment is actually very similar to the previous one, it took less than that. It took 9 months. Yeah? And so we don't want to overgeneralize from two cases, and we're right now in the process of redoing this for lots of other situations, because at the time net sentiment was done manually with human coders. Now we can have sentiment engines. But the bottom line is that in both of these cases, it was well within the re-election cycle. Bloomberg did get re-elected, and the mayor of the premier of British Columbia did get re-elected twice. And as you know, the carbon tax is still in place there. So, to sort of finish part one, the takeaway is that status quo bias exists because we tend to consider the status quo first, or we think about sort of what we lose when we give up the status quo. But there's a very simple solution to sort of making the status quo bias go away, which is to make dominating options that have sort of longer, long-term benefits, for society, for individuals, making those the default option. The question is how to do that, and we can talk about that in our discussion period. So let me now switch to two motivational interventions. This one was a cognitive intervention in the sense that it has to do with how our brain is wired to process information. One option at a time, perhaps switching back and forth, but with an advantage to the first option considered. I should say there are many other arguments for when people consider an option first. Status quo is just one of them, an understandable one. How attractive something feels is something to do with, oftentimes signaled by the label. People, especially in the United States, don't like taxes. Especially don't like carbon taxes. A carbon dividend sounds a lot nicer. The same people who argue against carbon taxes buy carbon offsets. Those indulgences that we can buy to fly across the Atlantic without feeling guilty about it. We've shown using query theory that sort of people will look at the option that includes the carbon user fee first when it's called a carbon offset. It doesn't matter whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, you look at that first, you generate more arguments for it, you're more likely to choose it. There's no difference based on ideology for carbon offsets, but you will not do that for a carbon tax. Republicans, or I should say Democrats, are just as likely to buy the user fee if it's called a tax, but Republicans, it goes way south. If you do the follow-up study about basically getting people to generate arguments in the opposite order, and you ask a Republican, you show the Republicans the carbon tax label and ask them, do you want to buy this ticket or the one without the tax? And you tell them to first generate arguments for the inclusive ticket with the tax, they will actually not follow instructions. About half of them will not do it in the order you tell them. So much for sort of saying that people will do whatever the person in the white lab coat is telling them. There's such a knee-jerk reaction against sort of generating arguments first against something that you deeply dislike at a visceral level that they will not follow instructions. But those, I should say, those who do follow instructions show a change in their preference as a result of that. Okay, so now let's move to these two motivational interventions. So the first one is priming legacy motives. And as you know, legacy motives are being used to induce pro-social intergenerational actions. They're being used in fundraising a lot. Obviously, it's called legacy motives because it has to do with sort of passing things on, including money to future generations. But we asked the questions, can we use legacy motives to encourage climate change action? The notion being that climate change action is a pro-social act. You're doing something not for yourself necessarily, but for your children, for your grandchildren, for distant others. And so again, the pattern is we'll do two studies. The first one will show correlational evidence that legacy motivation, people who have stronger legacy motivation are maybe more likely to act on climate change mitigation. And then we'll do a second study where we manipulate people's legacy motives and then see whether that actually affects their actions. So providing some causal evidence for that. Okay, so the first one is an online study. We measure people's legacy motivations with 8 items like I feel connected to future generations. We ask them about their beliefs about climate change on a 5-item scale. We measure their pro-environmental behavioral intentions to do something about climate change. And we actually ask them for a donation to an environmental charity, where they basically earn $10 and they can give some of that money to Trees for the Future and keep the rest for themselves. This is real money. I think 1 in 10 actually sort of gets the money that they allocate to themselves for themselves, and the other money gets sent to this particular charity. So it's as close as we can come to something that's an actual behavior in an online study. Does it make a difference how people score on their legacy motives? So here's legacy motives as a z-score. 0 means that you're at the mean. -2 means that you're 2 standard deviations below the mean. And then we have our 3 dependent measures. Their behavioral intention to do something about climate change, their beliefs in climate change, and the actual donation to the NGO. And as you can see, they all have positive slopes, and they're all significant slopes. In other words, the stronger your legacy motives are in this correlational study, the more likely are you going to sort of give to charity, have stronger beliefs in climate change, have strong intentions to do something about climate change. It's non-trivial in terms of donation. If you're in the bottom quartile on that DV, you on average average people gave $1.75, and 22% of people did that, and that in the top quartile, this almost doubled, yeah, and 10% more actually gave some money. So what about manipulating legacy motives? Well, we basically ask people to write a little essay, instructions about what you want to be remembered for, and they spend something like 5 minutes writing this essay, impact of other people, future generations, teaching others, and the control group didn't write an essay. Yeah, we also done it, the treatment group writes an essay on what they want to be remembered for, and the other one writes an essay, the control group writes an essay on sort of how they go grocery shopping. Yeah? So that's not the act of writing an essay or not. What we have is that basically we're showing that behavioral intentions do go up now in the group who was prompted to write the essay. Okay, they have stronger intentions to do something about climate change. They also donate more money to cancer. And then the question is this actually mediated by a stronger legacy motives? And you can see, yes, the treatment group has a stronger legacy motive, which we measure afterwards, after they do all these things. And so this suggests that and you can just sort of show, again, by doing a mediation, that legacy motives, the effect of the essay prime on legacy motives partially mediates the effect on beliefs and on action. Okay, so basically, so to wrap up part 2, we've shown that sort of activating that set of values, that set of motivations that are other regarding, concern to pass things onto future generations does help, does make action related to climate change more likely and stronger. So let's move on to the third part of my presentation, which is another motivational mechanism, which has to do with the fact that when you're asking people to take action, to sacrifice some money, some comfort, some standard of living now for the benefit of the future, that's only a good investment if you think there is a future, right? If the world were coming to an end in 2050, we wouldn't be arguing sort of how to get to 2 degrees. There's a little sense of that. And presumably, the longer your time horizon is, the longer you think these things will be around, humans will be on planet Earth, the more likely will you think it's a good investment to give up that X amount of money or comfort now for the future. So the question is, how can we get people to think about having a long and proud future? Well, it turns out Churchill has said everything. Churchill said, the longer you look back, the further you look forward. So he basically suggested that the past is a mirror for the future. There's also an astrophysicist who actually gave us the idea for this study called God. And for the Germans in the room, that's like a great name for an astrophysicist. But yeah, he came to Berlin in the, I think, late 1960s, saw the Berlin Wall and said, I wonder how long the Berlin Wall will continue to exist. Now, being a scientist, he said, well, let me figure this one out. Let's work from first principles. Anything has a start point, and everything has an end point. There's an interval from start to finish. And if you don't know where you are, you can basically be dropped into that interval at any point in time, right? And so you can be very close to the start, then there's a long future, you can be very close to the end, then there's a short future, you can be somewhere in the middle. All other things being equal, since you don't know where you're being dropped randomly, on average, you're going to get dropped in the middle, right? So there's a mean of where you're going to be dropped is in the middle. And if you're in the middle, then basically sort of going to in the past, how long has this thing existed already, is a pretty good predictor for how long it will continue to exist. By the same kind of argument, you can also put confidence interval around your best predictor. Okay, so you can put a 95% confidence interval about how long the Berlin Wall will continue to exist. Well, turns out the actual duration of the wall was smack in the middle of that confidence interval. Yeah? And since then, God actually has gone on to sort of make a little side career out of this. And he second. But we also measure people's closeness to future generations by sort of having them judge and overlap how much they think they are similar to future generations, with the argument that you're only going to invest in the future, even if you think there's a long future, if you care about it. And so this is along the lines that you could, which is a general point to make. It's very hard to actually trick or nudge people into behavior that's not in their own interest. Nudges oftentimes are like signposts that tell you what it is that you are concerned about, and make it more likely that you actually satisfy those needs. But people who don't have that particular motivation, who don't have that particular preference, are very, very rarely so swayed by that. Okay? So what we do here is half of the people in this online survey are being told about the US being a relatively new country by basically starting arbitrarily at the Roman Empire in our timeline. And obviously sort of the 1492 to now is a very short blip with that kind of timeline. Not a lot of room for even photos to show you about sort of how great the United States is. But in the other condition, the old US condition, quote unquote, we basically have Christopher Columbus sailing from Spain as a starting point, and then the starting point in the United States, 1776, that now has a much larger share of the timeline, with many more images that show you how glorious the United States is and has been. And so does that make a difference in terms of people's willingness to invest in an environmental NGO or as a dependent measure, again, an actual donation? And the answer is yes. Basically, the effect of donations is out of $20. In the old US condition, people give $13.13 to the environmental NGO, whereas only $9.84 for the young US. And then more importantly, there's this interaction between closest to future generations. The manipulation is highly successful, changing donation from $5 to actually to almost close to $20 for the situation where people do care about future generations, and there's no effect for that. Okay, so let me conclude. What I want to argue is that the future can be made more salient by understanding more how cognitively we make decisions that involve trade-offs between time horizons, and understanding why we make such decisions. So the cognitive and motivational components, either changing, making the future options a default option, or in terms of motivation, activating legacy motives, or emphasizing a long and successful past. One question is, well, how do these different dimensions go together, in the sense that in real environments we have both cognition and motivation? What are the best ensembles? Which are the most synergistic ways of combining these interventions? We talk about the acceptability of these kinds of nudges if we want in our discussion. And so to conclude, I want to argue that sort of assuming bounded rationality rather than rationality as the underlying assumption that guides our decisions in the space between behavior, energy, and the environment is a much more realistic assumption. It makes for better forecasts and hopefully for more action.
Okay, we've got time, of course, for some questions, and yeah, off you go. Yes, it's you. Yes, but you're going to have to say that.
Yeah, thank you very much, everyone. I have a question concerning the influence of scientists on political and economic decision makers. You have briefly touched this aspect, and I would like you to elaborate on this point. What are the options and what are the limitations of scientists who influence political and economic decision makers? Because obviously scientists are in a more they're not always in the position to actually implement their own results. So what is your experience on this question?
So I think it's a great question. You can answer that both from the perspective of the scientists and from the perspective of politicians, or business leaders. So obviously, scientists, climate scientists, economists who study the impact of our climate system, CO2 emissions on the economy, engineers, they have a reason to listen to scientists because scientists have the relevant facts. Right? They also, in most countries of the world, still have a pretty high trust value. It's not as high in the United States as in other countries, but it's still way above many other professionals in even in the United States. The problem with scientists is that they're not they're at least trained, not motivated, to communicate their science in a policy relevant fashion. Scientists are trained to be neutral, just the facts, ma'am, and sort of not to advocate. And what that really means is we communicate to policymakers the way we communicate to fellow scientists. There's a lot of debate actually in social sciences whether or not it's good or bad to communicate the degree of uncertainty we have about facts. One sort of simple, or let's say one side of the argument is that it's bad to do that because the public, or even policymakers will misinterpret the uncertainty. I think we don't know everything means we know nothing about it, or there's actually doubt about sort of the presence of the phenomena. Of course, that's being amplified by the quote-unquote merchants of doubt, sort of, who have imported those tactics from the tobacco debate 20 or 30 years ago. And so I think the problem is that scientists neither want to necessarily sort of influence policymakers, nor do they have the tools how to do that effectively. And as I said, there's some unresolved questions. I actually personally think it's not good to hide uncertainty. It's a matter of how you communicate it, because otherwise you lose trust. People think that you're trying to hide things from them. That's another good state of affairs. And then on the part of the policymakers, I think there's this. Now we get into like another side of non-rational narrative, which is wishful thinking, and inconvenient truth. And especially in this space, sort of where you have policymakers have multiple objectives. Climate change, sustainability is just one of the many objectives. So they have to worry about growth. They have to worry about like a host of other arguments in the objective function. They have to make trade-offs. And oftentimes, the trade-offs involved in sort of really truly listening to what climate science is telling us about how we have to sort of plan for the future. It's not a pretty picture. It's not something that we necessarily want to do. So I think sort of this, that motivated reasoning probably has as much to do from science being ignored on that side than as it does that the scientists are not trained to communicate effectively. So I think that there's so many reasons why we miscommunicate.
Another question?
In that case, how would you explain such tremendous action in Britain's Climate Change Act of 2008, European Directive 2009? What's so different about Europeans that they can do it and they're willing to look at the future, they're willing to take fixed cost, which is actually negligible. I mean, you said it's high cost, that's an American belief. It's not true at all that it's a high cost. Getting rid completely of carbon will be very expensive. But making enough steps to get rid of carbon, Britain's more than halved the amount of carbon dioxide it puts out since 1979, and that per capita is below any level since 1860. Right? Really fantastic reductions in it, and almost nobody's noticed it gets so into the mining carbon. That could be dealt with in this cost. So what's so bad about America?
Then you count the ways. I think one of the big problems is campaign financing the United States, and being beholden to vested interests, and I think that's probably where most of the fault lies.
I'll go on. Back to one thing we've got to get rid of. Elections must be funded by the state.
Okay, next question.
I wish there was a psychological reason, but I don't know what it is.
In the middle, yes.
Is there any examples, say from 100 years ago, where that the sort of actions that we're looking to take now for climate change was taken?
Well, I mean, we had Ford, at the beginning of the talk, and so we did make a transition from horses to cars. We changed from sailing boats, to steamboats. There have been many sort of technological transitions that we've taken. Maybe none of the scale that's facing us now, but I think all of these transitions happened by dying, and sort of old technologies dying off, being sort of slowly replaced, and also, it turns out that younger people are less status quo biased because they have sort of less to lose than older people. There's a generational effect. The problem with climate change is we don't have that luxury of learning by dying. The changes have to happen at a time scale that's not generational.
But surely those types of changes, the horse was easy to get through in a way, because we didn't understand the change from horses to cars and using energy in that way.
It took a while. It typically takes like 30
What was the were people aware of the dangers of that use of energy at the time? Well, we are now, and we're asking people to make massive changes now, saying because of the dangers.
Yeah.
Is there any example of that ever happening in our history where we were aware of the dangers and decided not to do it?
No, but I think there are also different dangers. This is like another talk I would have given on psychological risk dimensions and how sort of oftentimes the general public disagrees with technical experts on, for example, nuclear power. In fact, a lot of this research was funded by the nuclear power industry in the 1960s when we're trying to introduce nuclear-generated electricity in the United States. And, and technical experts were amazed that the American public didn't embrace sort of nuclear power as a generation technology because it was so much safer than coal-generated power in terms of mobility and mortality statistics. Now, turns out that, that people have different psychological risk dimensions that correlate very, very lowly at all with mobility and mortality statistics. They have to do with sort of how controllable the something seem, how much do we seem to know about it, to what extent do we sort of fear that particular risk. So it turns out nuclear power at the time especially was seen as like a highly dreaded risk. It's something, radiation kills you and you don't even know aware of it. Yeah? That makes it, that's the kind of thing that makes the little hair in the back of your neck stand up. It also was seen as highly sort of unknown. Turns out that in the meantime that sort of has come down, and the poster child for risk that has a lot of public endorsement on psychological risk dimensions is terrorism. Yeah? Reflected how much as a country as species we spent on defending ourselves against that. I stuck out my neck in 2006 and I said, I bet you climate change doesn't scale very high on this dread dimension. Yeah? It's the kind of thing that the experts tell us it's dangerous, but it's not the kind of thing, first of all, we don't experience the consequences of emitting carbon. It's not that we sort of immediately get shocked, there's no immediate feedback. It's something that's very gradual. It's not even our actions right now that are determining our climate system. It's what happened 200 years ago. There's a long time lag. So I said, I bet you it doesn't scale very high on dread. I meant it as a dare. Nobody took me up on it, so I had to do it myself a couple of years ago. And sure enough, I mean, it's way to the left of the mean here on this dread scale. It's not the kind of thing that wakes people up in the middle of the night. You might wake up because you're worried about your marriage, about your kids, but not climate change. At least, so not most of us.
What is required for people's values to change, and do people's values actually need to change? So there's an argument to say that sustainability is a bit of a communication fail because it's an argumentation that's been managed by the deep green movement and not anchored on the frames of reference of, if you're a Republican American in the Bible Belt or Brexiteer or whatever it is. So it's because it's too narrowly defined. But so do people's values need to change? And what is the process for that to happen?
So this gets back a little bit to what I said at the beginning about our sort of goals that we have. We have multiple goals, and we have sort of some goals that are selfish and self-regarding. We do have goals sort of that are other-regarding. And what I want to argue is that we all have sort of these goals inside of ourselves. That's part of our sort of what we were born with as human beings. But there are certainly cultural differences. There are national differences. There are regional differences in terms of individualism, collectivism. There was in-country differences as a function of professional training. And so what that means is that our different values sort of are chronically activated to different degrees, in part because of our early childhood experiences, childhood, our religious education, our professional training. And so what that means is that basically sort of, it's not that people's values have to change. What needs to change is sort of how chronically active certain values are. And that gets into this hierarchy of needs that Maslow talked about a long time ago. It makes perfect sense in terms of sort of evolution that we're most concerned about us and about the here and now. Because if you're not concerned about yourself and here and now, you're not going to be around tomorrow to worry about the future. But in our current environment, we also have to have sort of a more a larger emphasis on these values that are not chronically active. And then the question is, well, how do you do that? And to your second part of your question, who's the messenger to do that? And there will be different messengers for different audiences. And so for some people it will be Al Gore, for other people it will be sort of the preacher in your evangelical church. And for a while we actually had interest. I mean, most religions actually sort of have, Pope Francis most recently, Islam, most religions actually sort of profess that they're concerned about stewardship of the earth and sustainability. But again, I think for some people it's the military. including the United States. The military actually is deeply concerned about climate change, in part because its naval bases are being flooded, and it's a huge security risk. But the military hasn't been very, very active in that, and very vocal in that. So,
Okay. Second to last question, Adrian.
Yeah, thanks very much. You haven't said very much about the role of emotion. And as you know, there's an awful lot of literature and renewed debate about the role that fear might play compared to hope, and which is best to save it to efficacy. Is that because you think this isn't a relevant debate, what you're talking about is much more relevant, or do you think that it's a stale debate? I'm just wondering why this sort of non-mention of emotions and the role that they play possibly in changing behaviour.
for me, it was Sophie's choice. I could have given you 4 or 5 different talks, and it's very hard to figure out which one is best. And I got some input from Gordon on that, but I could have given you a talk on the role of emotions. And basically, would have said that messaging with respect to fear and messaging with respect to guilt is a great way of getting people's attention, but it only really works if there's a simple and ideally a single action that you can take to sort of basically turn that nagging signal down, because nobody wants to be in a negative state of mood for a protected period of time. And so I think in the context of climate change, where that requires sustained action, over on many dimensions, so if you do that, you basically get more licensing. You do one thing to make that feeling of guilt go away, but then since that signal has been turned off, so you're not going to continue that in the future. So I think appealing to people's pride and appealing to people's identity in a positive way is probably a much better way forward. And I do think that these things are sort of complementary. I don't think it's stale at all.
The graph you showed for the adjustment of
The sentiment.
the status quo. Are there similarities there with graphs for major life events like divorce, bereavement, redundancy, where there's the psychological responses, disbelief, anger, resentment, and gradual acceptance, and coming to terms with the new status quo?
That's a really interesting observation. I hadn't thought about that. And so I guess the short answer is it probably is similar, but I don't know, but it's very interesting.
Watch the next paper. Okay, next question. Anyway, any last questions before drinks? Oh, gosh, yeah, okay. You stand between Amy and Elke.
I'm interested in the protest vote that the Republicans gave, that they didn't want to go through the cognitive process of explaining climate change. So if you ask people for their willingness to pay for a whale to survive, some people will protest, but that's actually a meaningful protest. They're saying you can't value this whale. You need this natural base of capital that we can't trade in for money. And so it's a meaningful protest vote. Is there a meaningful protest vote there for the Republicans?
Yeah, so you're basically saying they look at this as a taboo trade-off of sorts, or signaling that they're not willing to do that. Yeah. I think that's certainly a plausible interpretation of that.
Okay, well, I'd like to thank you, Mr. Weber, very much, but I would actually like Bruce to do that. So, Bruce, if you...
Thank you, Elke.
Wait, they're colleagues.
Actually, Elke and I overlapped briefly at Columbia Business School, and when Gordon mentioned that you were being invited this year, I was thrilled that you were coming. I also just want to mention, this is our 3rd year of this lecture series, this memorial series for Adrian and Fernando. I recognize a lot of familiar faces, Miko Securities. For those who are here in past years, thank you for coming back. And for those who are new to this series, thank you for coming the first time. We will have a 4th one next year, so I hope you're all here again next year. Thank you for coming, and again, thank you very much.
Drinks downstairs.